Chapter 9 of Murder in the Gunroom. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Murder in the Gunroom by H. Beam Piper. Chapter 9. Rand found another car, a smoke-gray Plymouth coupe, standing on the left of his Lincoln when he went down to the garage. Running his car outside and down to the highway, he settled down to his regular style of driving. A barely legal 50 miles per hour, punctuated by bursts of absolutely felonious speed whenever he found an unobstructed straightway. Entering Rosemont, he slowed and went through the underpass at the railroad tracks, speeding again when he was clear of the village. A few minutes later, he was turning into the crushed limestone drive that led up to the buff brick Gresham house. A girl met him at the door, a cute little redhead in a red-striped dress, who gave him a smile that seemed to start on the bridge of her nose and lift her whole face up after it. She held out her hand to him. "Colonel Rand!" she exclaimed. "I'll bet you don't remember me." "Sure I do. You're Dot," Rand said. "At least I think you are. The last time I saw you, you were in pigtails, and you were only about so high." He measured with his hand. "The last time I was here, you were away at school. You must be old enough to vote by now." "I will this fall," she replied. "Come on in, you're the first one here. Daddy hasn't gotten back from town yet. He called and said he'd be delayed till about 9. In the hall, she took his hat and coat and guided him toward the parlor on the right. "Oh, Mother," she called, "here's Colonel Rand." Rand remembered Irene Gresham, too, an overaged dizzy blonde who was still living in the flaming youth era of the 20s. She was an extremely good egg. He liked her very much. After all, insisting upon remaining an F. Scott Fitzgerald character was a harmless and amusing foible, and it was no more than right that somebody should try to keep the bright banner of Jazz-Age innocence flying in a grim and sullen world. He accepted a cigarette, shared the flame of his lighter with mother and daughter, and submitted to being gushed over. "And honestly, Jeff, you get handsomer every year," Irene Gresham rattled on. "Dot, doesn't he look just like Clark Gable on Gone with the Wind? But then, of course, Jeff really is a Southerner, so—" The doorbell interrupted this slight non sequitur. She broke off, rising. "Sit still, Jeff. I'm going to see who it is. You know, we're down to only one servant now, and it seems as if it's always her night off, or something. I don't know, honestly, what I'm going to do." She hurried out of the room. Voices sounded in the hall, a man and a girl's. "That's Pierre and Karen," Dot said. "Let's all go up in the gunroom and wait for the others there." They went out to meet the newcomers. The man was a few inches shorter than Rand, with gray eyes that looked startlingly light against the dark brown of his face. He wasn't using a cane, but he walked with a slight limp. Beside him was a slender girl almost as tall as he was, with dark brown hair and brown eyes. She wore a rust-brown sweater and a brown skirt, and low-heeled walking shoes. Irene Gresham went into the introductions. The newcomers shook hands with Rand and were advised that the style of address was Jeff, rather than Colonel Rand. And then Dot suggested going up to the gunroom. Irene Gresham said she'd stay downstairs. She'd have to let the others in. "Have you seen this collection before?" Pierre Jarret inquired as he and Rand went upstairs together. "About 2 years ago," Rand said. Stephen had just gotten a cased dueling set by Wilkinson then. "From the Far West Hobby Shop, I think." "Oh, he's gotten a lot of new stuff since then, and sold off about a dozen culls and duplicates," the former Marine said. "I'll show you what's new, till the others come." They reached the head of the stairs and started down the hall to the gunroom in the wing that projected out over the garage. Along the way, the girls detached themselves for nose powdering. Unlike the room at the Fleming house, Stephen Gresham's gunroom had originally been something else, a nursery or playroom or party room. There were windows on both long sides, which considerably reduced the available wall space, and the situation wasn't helped any by the fact that the collection was about 30% long arms. Things were pretty badly crowded. Most of the rifles and muskets were in circular barracks racks, away from the walls. "Here, this one's new since you were here," Pierre said, picking a long musket from one of the racks and handing it to Rand. "How do you like this one?" Rand took it and whistled appreciatively. "Real European matchlock. No, I never saw that." Looks like North Italian, say 1575 to about 1600. That musket, Pierre informed him, came over on the Mayflower. Really, or just a gag? Rand asked. It easily could have. The Mayflower Company bought their muskets in Holland from some 17th century forerunner of Bannerman's, and Europe was full of muskets like this then, left over from the wars of the Holy Roman Empire and the French religious wars. Yes, I suppose all their muskets were obsolete types for the period, Pierre agreed. Well, that's a real Mayflower arm. Stephen has the documentation for it. It came from the Charles Winthrop Sawyer collection. And there were only 3 ownership changes between the last owner and the Mayflower Company. Stephen only paid $100 for it, too. That was practically stealing, Rand said. He carried the musket to the light and examined it closely. Nice condition, too. I wouldn't be afraid to fire this with a full charge right now. He handed the weapon back. He didn't lose a thing on that deal. I should say not. I'd give him $200 for it any time. Even without the history, it's worth that. Who buys history, anyhow? Rand wanted to know. The fact that it came from the Sawyer collection adds more value to it than this Mayflower business. Past ownership by a recognized authority like Sawyer is a real guarantee of quality and authenticity. But history, documented or otherwise, hell, only yesterday I saw a pair of pistols with a wonderful 350-year documented history. Only not a word of it was true. The pistols were made about 20 years ago. Those wheel locks Fleming bought from Arnold Rivers? Pierre asked. God, wasn't that a crime? I'll bet Rivers bought himself a big drink when Lane Fleming was killed. Fleming was all set to hang Rivers' scalp in his wigwam. But with Stephen, the history does count for something. As you probably know, he collects arms types that figured in American history. Well, he can prove that this individual musket was brought over by the Pilgrims, so he can be sure it's an example of the type they used. But he'd sooner have a typical Pilgrim musket that never was within 5,000 miles of Plymouth Rock than a non-typical arm brought over as a personal weapon by one of the Mayflower Company. Oh, none of us are really interested in the individual history of collection weapons, Rand said. You show me a collection that's full of known history arms, and I'll show you a collection that's either full of junk or else costs 3 times what it's worth. And you show me a collector who blows money on history, and 9 times out of 10 I'll show you a collector who doesn't know guns. I saw one such collection once. Every item had its history neatly written out on a tag and hung onto the trigger guard. The owner thought that the patent dates on Colts were model dates, and the model dates on French military arms were dates of fabrication. Pierre wrinkled his nose disgustedly. God, I hate to see a collection all fouled up with tags hung on things, he said. Or stuck over with gummed labels. That's even worse. Once in a while I get something with a label pasted on it, usually on the stock, and after I get it off, there's a job getting the wood under it rubbed up to the same color as the rest of the stock. Yes, I picked up a lovely little rifle flintlock pistol once, Rand said. American. Full-length, curly maple stock, really a Kentucky rifle in pistol form. Whoever had owned it before me had pasted a slip of paper on the underside of the stock, between the trigger guard and the lower ramrod thimble, with a lot of crap, mostly erroneous, typed on it. It took me 6 months to remove the last traces of where that thing had been stuck on. What do you collect, or don't you specialize? Pistols. I try to get the best possible specimens of the most important types. Special emphasis on British arms after 1700 and American arms after 1800. What I'm interested in is the evolution of the pistol. I have a couple of wheel locks, to start with, and 3 Miguelet locks, and an Italian snap-haunce. Then I have a few early flintlocks and a number of mid-18th century types, and some late flintlocks and percussion types, and about 20 Colts and so on through percussion revolvers, and early cartridge types to some modern arms, including a few World War II arms. I see. About the same idea Lane Fleming had, Pierre said. I collect personal combat arms, firearms, and edge weapons. Arms that either influenced fighting techniques or were developed to meet special combat conditions. From what you say, you're mainly interested in the way firearms were designed and made. I'm interested in the conditions under which they were used. And Adam Trehearne, who'll be here shortly, collects pistols and a few long arms in wheel-lock, proto-flintlock, and early flintlock to 1700. And Philip Cabot collects U.S. Marshals, flintlock to automatic, and also enemy and allied army weapons from all of our wars. And Colin McBride collects nothing but Colts. Odd how a Scot who's only been in this country 20 years should be interested in so distinctively American a type. "And I collect anything I can sell at a profit, from Chinese matlocks to Tommy guns," Karen Lawrence interjected, coming into the room with Doc Gresham. Pierre grinned. "Karen is practically a unique specimen herself, the only general antique dealer I've ever seen who doesn't hate the sight of a gun collector." "That's only because I'm crazy enough to want to marry one," the girl dealer replied. "Of all the miserly, unscrupulous, grasping characters—" She expressed a doubt that the average gun collector would pay more than 10 cents to see his lord and savior riding to hounds on a Bren carrier. "They don't give a hoot whose grandfather owned what, and if anything's battered up a little, they don't think it looks quaint. They think it looks lousy. And they've never heard of inflation. They think arms ought still to sell for the sort of prices they brought at the old Mark Field sale back in 1911. "What are you looking at?" Dot asked Rand, then glanced at the musket in Pierre's hands. "Oh, Priscilla!" Karen laughed. "Dot not only knows everything in the collection, she knows it by name. Dot, show Colonel Rand Hester Prynne." "Hester coming up," Gresham's daughter said, catching another musket out of the same rack from which Pierre had gotten the matchlock, and passing it over to Rand. He grasped the heavy piece, approving of the easy, instinctive way in which the girl had handled it. "Look on the barrel," she told him. "On top, right at the breech." The gun was a flintlock, or rather a doglock. Sure enough, stamped on the breech was the big A of the Company of Workmen Armourers of London, the 17th Century Gunmakers' Guild. "That's right," he nodded. "That's Hester Prynne, all right, the first American girl to make her letter." There were footsteps in the hall outside, and male voices. Adam and Colin, Pierre recognized them before they entered. Both men were past 50. Colin McBride was a 6-foot black Highlander, black eyes, black hair, and a black weeping willow mustache from under which a stubby pipe jutted. Except when he emptied it of ashes and refilled it, it was a permanent fixture of his weather-beaten face. Trehearne was somewhat shorter and fair. His sandy mustache, beginning to turn gray at the edges, was clipped to micrometric exactness. They shook hands with Rand, who set Hester back in her place. Trehearne took the matchlock out of Pierre's hand and looked at it wistfully. "Some chaps have all the luck," he commented. "What do you think of it, Mr. Rand?" Pierre, who had made the introductions, had respected the detective's present civilian status. "Or don't you collect long arms?" "I don't collect them, but I'm interested in anything that'll shoot. That's a good one. Those things are scarce, too." "Yes, you'll find 100 wheel locks for every matchlock, and yet there must have been 100 matchlocks for every wheel lock." "Matchlocks were cheap, and wheel locks were expensive," McBride suggested. He spoke with the faintest trace of Highland accent. "Naturally, they got better care." "It would take a Scot to think of that," Karen said. "Now, you take a Scot who collects guns, and you have something." "That's only part of it," Rand said. "I believe that by the last quarter of the 17th century, most of the matchlocks that were lying around had been scrapped and the barrels used in making flintlocks. Hester Prynne, over there, could easily have started her career as a matchlock. And then a great many matchlocks went into the West African slave and ivory trade, and were promptly ruined by the natives." "Yes, and I seem to recall having seen Spanish and French miguelet muskets that looked as though they had been altered directly from matchlock, retaining the original stock and even the original lock plate," Trehearne added. "So have I, come to think of it." Rand stole a glance at his wristwatch. It was 9:05. He was wishing Stephen Gresham would put in an appearance. McBride and Trehearne joined Pierre and the girls in showing him Gresham's collection. Evidently, they all knew it almost as well as their own. After a while, Irene Gresham ushered in Philip Cabot. He, too, was past middle age, with prematurely white hair, and a thin, scholarly face. According to Hollywood typecasting, he might have been a professor, or a judge, or a Boston Brahmin. but never stockbroker. Irene Gresham wanted to know what everybody wanted to drink. Rand wanted bourbon and plain water. McBride voted for Jamaican rum. Trehearne and Cabot favored brandy and soda, and Pierre and the girls wanted Bacardi and Coca-Cola. "And Stephen will want rye and soda when he gets here," Irene said. "Come on, girls, let's rustle up the drinks." Before they returned, Stephen Gresham came in, lighting a cigar. It was just 9:22. "Well, I see everybody's here," he said. "No, where's Karen?" Pierre told him. A few minutes later, the women returned, carrying the bottles and glasses. When the flurry of drink mixing had subsided, they all sat down. "Let's get the business over first," Gresham suggested. "I suppose you've gone over the collection already, Jeff?" "Yes, and first of all, I want to know something. When was the last that any of you saw it?" Gresham and Pierre had been in Fleming's gunroom just 2 days before the fatal accident. "And can you tell me if the big Whitneyville Colt was still there, then?" Rand asked. "Or the Rappahannock Forge, or the Collier flintlock, or the Hall?" "Why, of course." "My God, aren't they there now?" Gresham demanded. Rand shook his head. "And if Fleming still had them 2 days before he was killed, then somebody's been weeding out the collection since. Doing it very cleverly, too," he added. "You know how that stuff's arranged, and how conspicuous a missing pistol would be. Well, when I was going over the collection, I found about 24 pieces of the most utter trash. Things Lane Fleming wouldn't have allowed in the house, all hanging where some really good item ought to have been." He took a paper from his pocket and read off a list of the dubious items, interpolating comments on the condition, and a list of the real rarities which Gresham had mentioned the day before, which were now missing. "All that good stuff was there the last time I saw the collection," Gresham said. "What do you say, Pierre?" "I had the Hall pistol in my hands," Pierre said, "and I remember looking at the Rappahannock Forge." Trehearne broke in to ask how many English doglocks there were, and if the Snap-Haunce Highlander and the big all-steel wheel lock were still there. At the same time, Cabot was inquiring about the Springfield 1818 and the Virginia Manufactory pistols. "I'll have a complete itemized list in a few days," Rand said. "In the meantime, I'd like a couple of you to look at the collection and help me decide what's missing. I'm going to try to catch the thief and then get at the fence through them." "Think Rivers might have gotten the pistols?" Gresham asked. "He's the crookedest dealer I know of." "He's the crookedest dealer anybody knows of," Rand amended. "The only thing, he's a little too anxious to buy the collection for somebody who's just skimmed off the cream." $10,000 isn't much in the way of anxiety," Cabot said. "I call that a nominal bid to avoid suspicion. The dope's changed a little on that." Rand brought him up to date. "Rivers' offer is now $25,000. There was a stunned hush, followed by a gust of exclamations. "Good Lord!" The Scots accent fairly curdled on Colin McBride's tongue. "We cannot go over that." "I'm afraid not. 20 would be about our limit," Gresham agreed. "And with the best items gone—" He shrugged. Pierre and Karen were looking at each other in blank misery. Their dream of establishing themselves in the arms business had blown up in their faces. "Oh, he's talking through his hat," Cabot declared. "He just hopes we'll lose interest, and then he'll buy what's left of the collection for a song." "Maybe he knows the collection's been robbed," Trehearne suggested. "That would let him out later. He'd accuse you or the Fleming estate of holding out the best pieces, and then offer to take what's left for about $5,000. "Well, that would be presuming that he knows the collection has been robbed," Cabot pointed out. "And the only way he'd know that would be if he himself had bought the stolen pistols." "Well, does anybody need a chaser to swallow that?" Trehearne countered. "I'm bloody sure I don't." Karen Lawrence shook her head. "No, he'd pay $25,000 for the collection, just as it stands, to keep Pierre and me out of the arms business. This end of the state couldn't support another arms dealer, and with the reputation he's made for himself, he'd be the one to go under." She stubbed out her cigarette and finished her drink. "If you don't mind, Pierre, I think I'll go home." "I'm not feeling very festive myself, right now." The ex-Marine rose and held out his hand to Rand. "Don't get the idea, Jeff, that anybody here holds this against you. You have your client's interest to look out for." Well, if this be treason, make the most of it, Rand said. But I hope Rivers doesn't go through with it. I'd like to see you people get the collection, and I'd hate to see a lot of nice pistols like that get into the hands of a damned swindler like Rivers. Maybe I can catch him with the hot goods on him, and send him up for about 3 to 5. Oh, he's too smart for that, Karen despaired. He can get away with faking, but the dumbest jury in the world would know what receiving stolen goods was, and he knows it. Dorothy and Irene Gresham accompanied Pierre and Karen downstairs. After they had gone, Gresham tried, not very successfully, to interject more life into the party with another round of drinks. For a while, they discussed the personal and commercial inequities of Arnold Rivers. Trehearne and MacBride, who had come together in the latter's car, left shortly, and half an hour later Philip Cabot rose and announced that he, too, was leaving. "You haven't seen my collection since before the war, Jeff," he said. "If you're not sleepy, why don't you stop at my place and see what's new? You're staying at the Flemings'. My house is along your way, about a mile on the other side of the railroad." They went out and got into their cars. Rand kept Cabot's taillight in sight until the broker swung into his drive and put his car in the garage. Rand parked beside the road, took the Leech and Rigdon out of the glove box, and got out, slipping the Confederate revolver under his trouser band. He was pulling down his vest to cover the butt as he went up the walk and joined his friend at the front door. Cabot's combination library and gunroom was on the first floor. Like Rand's own collection, his collection was hung on racks over low bookcases on either side of the room. It was strictly a collector's collection, intensely specialized. There were all but a few of the U.S. regulation single-shot pistols, a fair representation of secondary types, most of the revolvers of the Civil War, and all the later revolvers and automatics. In addition, there were British pistols of the Revolution and 1812, Confederate revolvers, a couple of Spanish revolvers of 1898, the Lugers and Mausers and Steyers of the First World War, and the pistols of all our allies, beginning with the French weapons of the Revolution. "I'm having the devil's own time filling in for this last war," Cabot said. "I have a want ad running in the Rifleman, and I've gotten a few. That Nambu and that Japanese Model 14, and the Polish Radom and the Italian Glisenti, and that Tokarev, and of course the P-38 and the Canadian Browning, but it's going to take the devil's own time. I hope nobody starts another war for a few years till I can get caught up on the last one." Rand was looking at the Confederate revolvers. Griswold and Greer, Heyman Brothers, Tucker and Sherrod, Dance Brothers, and Park, Spiller and Burr. There it was. Leech and Rigdon. He tapped it on the cylinder with a finger. "Wasn't it one of those things that killed Lane Fleming?" he asked. "Leech and Rigdon? So I'm told." Cabot hesitated. "Jeff, I saw that revolver, not 4 hours before Fleming was shot. Had it in my hands, looked it over carefully." He shook his head. "It absolutely was not loaded. It was empty, and there was rust in the chambers." "Then how the hell did he get shot?" Rand wanted to know. "That I couldn't say. I'm only telling you how he didn't get shot. Here, this is how it was. It was a Thursday, and I'd come halfway out from town before I remembered that I hadn't bought a copy of Time, so I stopped at Biddle's drugstore in the village for one. Just as I was getting into my car, outside, Lane Fleming drove up and saw me. He blew his horn at me and then waved to me with the revolver in his hand. I went over and looked at it, and he told me he'd found it hanging back at the counter at a barbecue stand, where the road from Rosemont joins Route 22. There had been some other pistols with it, and I went to see them later, but they were all trash. The Leech and Rigdon had been the only decent thing there, and Fleming had talked it out of this fellow for $10. He was disgustingly gleeful about it, particularly as it was a better specimen than mine. "Would you know it if you saw it again?" Rand asked. "Yes, I remember the serials. I always look at serials on Confederate arms. The highest known serial number for Leech and Rigdon is 1393. This one was 1234. Rand pulled the .36 revolver from his pants leg and gave it a quick glance. The number was 1234. He handed it to Cabot. "Is this it?" he asked. Cabot checked the number. "Yes, and I remember this bruise on the left grip. Fleming was saying that he was glad it would be on the inside so it wouldn't show when he hung it on the wall. He carried the revolver to the desk and held it under the light. "Why, this thing wasn't fired at all!" he exclaimed. "I thought that Fleming might have loaded it, meaning to target it. He had a pistol range back of his house, but the chambers are clean." He sniffed at it. "Hops number 9, he said, "and I can see traces of partly dissolved rust, and no traces of fouling. What the devil, Jeff?" "It probably hasn't been fired since Appomattox," Rand agreed. "Philip, do you think all this didn't know it was loaded routine might be an elaborate suicide buildup, either before or after the fact?" "Absolutely not." There was a trace of impatience in Cabot's voice. "Lane Fleming wasn't the man to commit suicide. I knew him too well ever to believe that." "I heard a rumor that he was about to lose control of his company," Rand mentioned. "You know how much Premix meant to him." "That's idiotic." Cabot's voice was openly scornful now, and he seemed a little angry that Rand should believe such a story, as though his confidence in his friend's intelligence had been betrayed. "Good Lord, Jeff, where did you even hear a yarn like that?" Quote, "usually well-informed sources," unquote. "Well, they were unusually ill-informed that time," Cabot replied. "Take my word for it, there's absolutely nothing in it." "So it wasn't an accident, and it wasn't suicide," Rand considered. "Philip, what is the prognosis on this merger of Premix and National Milling and Packaging, now that Lane Fleming's opposition has been, shall we say, liquidated?" Cabot's head jerked up. He looked at Rand in shocked surprise. "My God, you don't think—" he began. "Jeff, are you investigating Lane Fleming's death?" "I was retained to sell the collection," Rand stated. "Now, I suppose I'll have to find out who's been stealing those pistols and recover them, and jail the thief and the fence. But I was not retained to investigate the death of Lane Fleming. And I do not do work for which I am not paid," he added, with mendacious literalness. "I see. Well, the merger's going through. It won't be official until the 16th of May, when the Premix stockholders meet, but that's just a formality. It's all cut and dried and in the bag now. Better let me pick you up a little Premix. There's still some lying around. You'll make a little less than 4 for 1 on it." "I'd had that in mind when I asked you about the merger," Rand said. "I have about 2,000 with you, haven't I?" He did a moment's mental arithmetic, then got out his checkbook. "Pick me up about 100 shares," he told the broker. "I've been meaning to get in on this ever since I heard about it." "I don't see how you did hear about it," Cabot said. "For obvious reasons, it's being kept pretty well under the hat." Rand grinned. Quote, "usually well-informed sources," unquote. Not the sources mentioned above. "Jeff, you know, this damn thing's worrying me," Cabot told him, writing a receipt and exchanging it for Rand's check. "I've been trying to ignore it, but I simply can't. Do you really think Lane Fleming was murdered by somebody who wanted to see this merger consummated, and who knew that this was an impossibility as long as Fleming was alive?" "Philip, I don't know. And furthermore, I don't give a damn," Rand lied. "If somebody wants me to look into it, and pays me my possibly exaggerated idea of what constitutes fair compensation, I will. And I'll probably come up with Fleming's murderer, dead or alive. But until then, it is simply no epidermis off my scrotum, and I advise you to adopt a similar attitude." They changed the subject, then, to the variety of pistols developed and used by the opposing nations in World War II, and the difficulties ahead of Cabot in assembling even a fairly representative group of them. Rand promised to mail Cabot a duplicate copy of his list of the letter code symbols used by the Nazis to indicate the factories manufacturing arms for them, as well as copies of some old wartime intelligence dope on enemy small arms. At a little past 1, he left Cabot's home and returned to the Fleming residence. There were 4 cars in the garage. The Packard sedan had not been moved, but the station wagon was facing in the opposite direction. The gray Plymouth was in the space for which Rand had driven earlier in the evening, and a black Chrysler Imperial had been run in on the left of the Plymouth. He put his own car in on the right of the station wagon, made sure that the Leech & Rigdon was locked in his glove box, and closed and locked the garage doors. Then he went up into the house, through the library, and by the spiral stairway to the gunroom. The garage had been open, he recalled, at the time of Lane Fleming's death. the availability of such an easy means of undetected ingress and egress threw the suspect field wide open. Anybody who knew the habits of the Fleming household could have slipped up to the gunroom while Varcek was in his lab, Dunmore was in the bathroom, and Gladys and Geraldine were in the parlor. As he passed the hall to his own room, Rand was thinking of how narrowly Arnold Rivers had escaped a disastrous lawsuit and criminal action by the death of Lane Fleming. End of Chapter 9.